networking and some meeting. And our plan tonight is to have a conversation about 45 minutes in length, a little bit of Q&A afterwards. And I think the speakers might even hang out and be willing to talk with you guys after, if that's what you want to do. As well, we have a live stream going on right here from BFast TV. So everyone all around the world can see what's going on, and we will also send you all a replay link. So if there's anything you missed, you don't have to take notes. You can check it all out. And then also, Happy New Year to all our Jewish friends out here. Shana Tova. And a couple things. I want to thank the co-organizers of Crypto Mondays. If you are here, Yulia, Jory, Andy, Lauren, you guys want to stand up real quick and just wave at everyone? All right. Thank you, guys. This is a volunteer nonprofit effort. We're just here to help build community and enable everyone to meet and do cool stuff and learn in this ever-changing marketplace. So without further ado, I'm going to start and let my panelists introduce themselves. We'll start with Carlo.
Hi, I'm Carlo Rasmurias. I'm co-founder and COO of CoinAlpha. And at CoinAlpha, we build blockchain-based asset management products and financial products. We have two products in the market right now. One's a fund protocol, which basically does fund administration on the blockchain. The other one, it's a basket protocol, which is a way to create diversified crypto portfolios in a non-custodial way. And one of the reasons I'm here is because we have two go-to-market strategies. One is we partnered with a U.S. broker-dealer to access the U.S. markets with Sharespost. The second one is we have a subsidiary that we've set up in Malta, and that's basically our HQ for non-US business.
Hi, my name is John Wu. I'm the CEO of the Digital Assets Group at Sharespost. So some disclaimer here, I'm not the CEO of Sharespost, CEO of the Digital Assets Group at Sharespost, which is all things crypto at Sharespost. What we're doing is we're trying to create a security token marketplace to allow compliant trading of security tokens, primarily the secondary trading of tokens. We're also creating asset management products partnered with Carlo's firm to create compliant crypto asset management products, which I'll let Carlo go into more detail. And we also are taking our infrastructure and creating effectively a SaaS-like product to allow global crypto exchanges to do compliant trades in the US and other places.
Timo, I'm co-founder of Swarm.fund, and we are a blockchain for security tokens. So we launched a live network in January, focusing on mostly on funds, basically tokenizing fund positions, private equity funds, hedge funds, impact funds. Now we've kind of added a couple of new categories. So we're doing things that are very crypto specific, such as masternodes, tokenization of, let's say, Dash masternodes or other collections of masternodes. We've also launched something that we call equity tokens, which allow people to buy into well-known privately held companies through tokens. So that's another innovation that we launched recently. We have about 30,000 users from more than 60 countries on Swarm today.
My name is Larry Kane. I'm a lawyer at Orrick Harrington. Welcome, everybody. I'm in our securities group and our blockchain working group. Our blockchain working group is a very large interdisciplinary group and international with attorneys in Asia as well as in Europe. I'm a securities lawyer, but we have lawyers in this area from tax to CFTC to market regulation to money transmitter laws. And so the one thing, if you're going to go into the space, it gets complicated real quickly, and there's a lot of legal needs around the space.
You would say that, wouldn't you?
Of course I would.
All right. Everybody. Well, great. Why don't we just start off by the big question, I think, on everyone's mind, which is, what's the state of the market today? What's going on? And on top of that, is the utility token marketplace dead, number one? And number two, when will security tokens get liquidity, and when will we start seeing some trading and some volume?
So I'll start. There's three questions there. First, the state of the market. Well, if you look at the amount of raises in utility tokens last year, month by month by month, June was a gigantic month, and then you had, subsequent months, and then December, another gigantic month. And as these tokens raised at various prices, every time you go through the average cost or average weight of ETH at that month, you're seeing a further sell-off in these markets. So you're probably going to continue to see this, hopefully stabilize, but there's a lot of supply still left in people who raised from last year, and it's unfortunate, but it's just the way it is right now. In terms of the when is the utility token market dead, and when are we going to see security token liquidity? So one of the things we're doing is trying to build a secondary marketplace for security tokens, and we need guys like Timo and other people in this room to continue to do the primary issuances. And if you track when these were done, they were done basically in the beginning of this year. Maybe some started in late 17. So in 2019, you have a lot of these tokens that are security type tokens that are in need to find a place for liquidity. And so I think the market's going to start to grow naturally in 2019.
Well, my take on it is that utility tokens are not dead at all. I think it's like...
So I didn't answer that question.
Yeah, no, so here's the thing. It's a very US-centric conversation, I think. And what I find, I mean, okay, I spend most of my time between the Valley and New York right now, but I just kind of sometimes think about it, like, when did that actually emerge, that discussion? And it emerged when, people started talking about, like, when you couldn't use SAFTs and stuff like that to do offerings here in the US. That's when that became, like, a big topic. Whereas internationally, it hasn't been at all, like, as important of a conversation. So it's a very kind of US-centric way of looking at things. So when we looked at, okay, what is actually happening here in the US, and you're kind of wondering why, Shapeshift and the other guys are basically forced to do what they're doing. Bittrex had a pretty rough winter in terms of delisting a bunch of coins, etc. So I think the fact of like the market situation right now is that basically you have Coinbase that allows you to trade in their retail wallet, basically BTC and Ethereum, which is exactly in line with what the SEC have said are so-called okay cryptocurrencies to be trading in a kind of a non-securities environment. Everything else is kind of in the unknown. So from that point of view, the utility token in the US is like still hinging on some kind of future signal from the SEC as to how these things are going to be handled. Now, they have the security tokens coming along, which is basically the new version of the ICO in the US, which has all these other characteristics that, our asset-backed tokens that we work with on Swarm, they basically are shared now. So now basically if you do an ICO in the US or you issue an asset-backed token representing real estate or fund or equities on Swarm, you basically have to follow the same regulatory rules as, whether you're doing an asset-backed or just an ICO. So I think that has kind of locked down the market in the US. And I see that that's going to take a long time before it kind of opens up and has any kind of super exciting growth because we have to wait these 12 months for the restricted securities. And then even if some of it is coming into play right now, we see that there's a lot of stuff actually that we can do potentially in Europe and Asia that's going to propel some of the security token markets ahead of the US. Yeah.
I guess I'll just add to that. One of the reasons we set up an offshore business is because just in the US, even though potentially a lot of other companies are transacting in quote-unquote utility tokens, there's still a lot of uncertainty around that. So the reason why we set up an entity in Malta is there's like very clear concepts. So in Malta, they just proposed and Parliament passed what's called the Virtual Financial Assets Bill, which creates distinguishes between virtual currencies, security tokens, and utility tokens. So that's a concept that's not only in Malta but also in Switzerland, even in EU and in Singapore as well, where they have this more clear framework for operating within this space. And so that's why, as a startup as well, as we want to get our products out to market more quickly, dealing with the regulatory uncertainty in the US is very challenging. Luckily, we have a good US broker partner to do that for the US market, but for the international markets, just working within more clear frameworks is easier for us to get to market.
So in your collective work in the security token space, is there one area that you're more focused on? Is it liquidity? Is it regulatory compliance? Is it educating your customers why they need a security token? Because in my experience, speaking with a lot of companies, are like, yeah, we wanted to do an ICO last year, we were going to do a utility token, but gee, we're kind of confused. We think we should do a security token, but there seems to be a lot of FUD out there. course, not helped by the SEC not giving any safe harbor.
So a couple things. We're using the term security token and utility token. The SEC in June, William Hinman, who's the director in the corporate finance group, did give some guidance on his opinion. And the SEC has been sort of consistently coming out with an approach that basically, when they're looking at a token, it's not necessarily the token itself that determines whether it's a security or utility token. It's facts and circumstances surrounding the offering and the use of the token. So if you're going out with a token to raise money from investors, and it looks like an investment, like an IPO, you're raising it from investors for a security purpose, like you would do with regular securities, they're going to classify that as a security. Now, if you have a decentralized network like Ethereum, the SEC will say that is a utility. So the question is always, how do you go from a security to a utility? And that's where we are still looking for guidance. Now, Mr. Heyman did provide 7 factors, and I encourage everybody to read his speech. It's the most current sort of guidance you have on it. But so when we talk about security token versus utility token, to me they're all tokens. It's just the manner and facts and circumstances of how you're issuing them. But today, basically, very difficult to get to that decentralized network that you see with Bitcoin and Ethereum. So if you're going to try to raise money through a token, you have to comply with the securities laws. And that's what we're talking about, a security token. It's a sale of either a SAFT or a token or some type of digital asset in compliance with U.S. securities laws. And the reason why you're hearing a little bit about the 1-year wait is that if you sell restricted securities, so there's 2 ways to sell securities. One is to register them, which is very expensive, through an S1 or Reg A+, or find an exemption through like Reg D, which is the most common exemption. And if you sell restricted securities in the United States, you have that 1-year lockup, which is why you're not seeing a lot of trading of those, because they're locked up for resale.
Yeah, I think I want to add one thing. I think in that statement from the SEC, I think the positive was that there was actually a statement that there would be like a path from going from a security status to a utility status, given that certain conditions were met. I think that was overall like a very positive evolution, although it didn't really provide, I suppose enough clarity around, exactly what the criteria for that would be.
Yeah, and what the SEC says is, come to them. So we've come to them on clients where we have a company that wants to issue some type of token, and the SEC wants you to come to them, give the case for it, and they won't give you firm relief whether the offering is compliant or not, but you can get a good sense what your approach is going to work. But we don't have a no action letter. You don't have the clear guidelines, but there is at least a path, and we would recommend eventually to go to the SEC before you do anything.
Also, it would help a lot if utility tokens actually had utility, yes. Which 90% of them don't. So
yeah, and you'll be always a security. That's true.
Very cool. So, John, here's one for you. So, obviously, there's been a move to tokenize assets. Sharespost was a leader in allowing privately held securities to be made available for sale. Now we're talking about a tokenized world. But just kind of give us the dummy answer here. Like, why is it a benefit to even tokenize an asset versus just a traditional capital structure where, let's say, I could buy a preferred stock or something? What's the difference, and why should people care about that?
Sure. Well, there are certain assets and certain securities that have benefits from being tokenized, and then there are others that probably don't make that much sense. If anything that needs to, like real estate is something that I'm seeing a lot. A lot of primary issuers are coming to me trying to tokenize either development assets or income generating existing buildings. That makes more sense to me than wanting to tokenize something that's already liquid and already small enough that individuals that don't need accreditation can buy. So I think the types of assets and securities that lend itself well to tokenization are ones that need to be fractionalized, the ones that can get more access to investors from a global perspective. Things that are illiquid, like a real estate asset, that want more liquid investment terms. And with the tokenization, you create more transparency in the process, and therefore you have more efficiency and can cut a lot of costs out of raising money for those types of things. Now, there are other assets, other securities that work pretty well right now as is, so it's not necessarily clear to me why those would need. So it's definitely a case by case.
So anyone else? Timo, do you have a take?
Yeah, I think I guess we started out on the fund side of things, where minimum tickets would be typically $1 to $5 million to get into any of the private equity funds that we were looking at tokenizing. And, so that was as much a question of almost like a democratization of finance, because it's like you have all these high yield products that are only available to institutional investors out there. And by the time they reach the retail investors, there's so many layers of fees that returns are kind of deteriorated to something that isn't that interesting anymore. So we saw that, like, if we can remove most of the middlemen in that equation, that would be valuable. So that was one thing. But I mean, I agree on the benefits of tokenization of assets. I just think, like, right now when you buy like private capital assets, it's a kind of a lawyer heavy process, and it's like paper heavy, and it's one-to-one. It's a private offering. It's pretty high touch. There's no infrastructure in place. I mean, there's little infrastructure in place to kind of automate most of those flows, for that kind of transaction. Like, imagine where there's a global infrastructure for trading security tokens, which can be traded, containing or representing any kind of underlying value. If that's in place, well, I mean, things change very quickly, because then all of a sudden you get liquidity, you get fractional ownership, you get all those benefits. And, just the liquidity aspect is going to drive price or value of an asset on its own right.
Yeah, so the one thing I think about is we've securitized assets for a long time. The securitization of credit cards, mortgage loans, commercial loans has gone for many, many years. I think the benefit of the tokenization is because when you do securitizations, it's all institutional. I mean, you don't have individuals doing that. So I think what this would do, if you comply with all the securities laws, is an ability to have still accredited investors be able to invest through a token in different assets that they normally would not have an investment choice on. So that's sort of the real neat, I think, thing about the whole tokenization of these assets.
So a question I've gotten a lot lately, I just got back from a road trip in Asia last week, and everyone's concerned about the volatility of a token, right? Like, okay, I get it. Tokenization of an asset makes sense. I like distributed nature. I like the viewability. But now I'm holding some token that I just look at the price of ETH, right? ETH and Bitcoin are down, 70, 80% from where they were a year ago. How do you ameliorate that sort of risk for holding a token that doesn't seem to be yet stable?
Well, once you start securitizing assets, there's an underlying asset associated with that token. So by definition, there will be less volatility. Part of the reason why there is so much volatility in the utility token world, or even the base layer protocol currencies, is just very hard to value these things. How do you value these things? So it's based on supply and demand. And the concept of reflexivity works very well on the way up as well as on the way down. But once you do have a security token, you can attribute underlying asset value. The volatility itself will be slightly handled. On second note, the whole world in crypto was becoming less volatile until very recently. In fact, if you look at Bitcoin since 2010 to today, it's about the same volatility as Google or Twitter or LinkedIn stock was in their first year as a public market stock. And same thing with Ethereum for a while. Unfortunately, volatility is down, but I mean, so the volatility of these things have been coming down as more participants have coming in. But primarily, like I said, once you have an asset associated with a security token, there's underlying value. It makes it a lot harder for these crazy vol skews that you see.
So, Carlo, you've spent a lot of time looking at jurisdictions outside the United States. As you said, you're establishing a venue in Malta. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how that came to, what your decision-making process was? Did you look at other jurisdictions like Cayman or Liechtenstein or other places, and how did that whole process work?
Sure. So when we first started, we did evaluate a number of different jurisdictions. So some of the main ones being Singapore, Gibraltar, Malta. The reason we settled on Malta is the parliament just passed a bill. So they're kind of the first jurisdiction that's taken more official steps to creating a path towards regulation. So parliament passed a bill in July. It's currently, they're setting up the rules, the framework for enacting that. And that's imminently going to be, within the next few months, actually be affected. And one of the other benefits for there as well is they give you a 12-month window to be compliant. So if we start operating now, the business now, we have within 12 months to become compliant. So that for us was a big benefit because we could basically start today and we'll have this window to become compliant. The main benefit as well as Malta, because it's in the EU, and one of the reasons we didn't pursue, say, Gibraltar is with Brexit looming over, so Gibraltar potentially may fall out of the EU. So staying with Malta gets us access within the EU. And one of the things in Singapore is, even though Singapore was one of the early supportive jurisdictions before probably last year, and they even issued guidance on digital token offerings, I think they've increasingly become more strict. And one other challenge with a crypto company is operationally. So for example, setting up bank accounts. We found that even in Singapore, that's become an increasing challenge. The banks just don't want to open accounts for companies involved in the space. Whereas in Malta, I think with the regulations coming out, there's banks who are willing to support the economy of the market. So that's, for operational reasons, we thought it made a lot of sense for us.
I mean, I was in Malta this summer, and I was impressed that I actually met the guy who's writing the regulations there, who's a lawyer. And the thing that, for me, that made a lot of sense was that they start with a definition of what is a digital asset, and then they build regulations around that. And so you think about, in the United States, we're operating under rules written in 1934. Just think if the FAA were operating under rules created in 1934 before they had planes flying, right? I mean, that'd be kind of crazy. But that's kind of what we're doing in these assets. So, I mean, for me, I think that makes a lot of sense to define, a new class of asset and then build regulation around that. Larry, what's your take on that?
I think, again, I'm not an investor, but I would have to imagine that people who want to make investments, you want to have a place where you have good foundation of the law. And when you have uncertainty, whoever invested in something a year ago that didn't fall necessarily, they thought they may have been following the 33 Act, but they didn't. It creates a lot of uncertainty. So I think places like Malta I think they just passed 3 more legislation that became effective July 1st, helps provide investors with some legal framework to understand that their investment will be legal versus illegal. A couple things, though, just, if you do something offshore, the U.S. has very long arms. The SEC's got very long arms. IRS has got very long arms. So you still need to be thinking compliance with U.S. regulation. You can't go to Malta, issue some type of ICO, and then have them immediately resold back in the United States. There's a bunch of regulations on restricting resales back to the United States. There's still KYC, AML, OFAC. There's a lot of other rules that you still need to be thinking about as you go offshore.
Now, what about, you hear some of these companies saying, we're not going to be operating in the United States, so, we don't have to be compliant because we don't allow our products to be sold by any U.S. investors. Does that get them off the hook?
If you're going to have U.S. investors buying it eventually, and there's an impact to the U.S. market, you're not off the hook. As I said, they've got long arms, and they're looking to protect U.S. investors. So,
I'll just add to that, I guess, for us, because even though we are not offering our offshore products to the U.S., we are still applying with FinCEN in operating a money transmitter business because our parent company is a U.S. company, and the subsidiaries engaging in transactions with digital assets. And one other thing is, we've looked at different trading venues, for example, decentralized exchanges, and what we found is kind of relevant to this discussion is, since decentralized exchanges, there's no KYC AML for the most part, one of the reasons there's very limited liquidity on that is because you can't guarantee, even if you say it's non-US, if there's no way to track who your counterparty is, first of all, you'll have challenges complying with KYC AML. Secondly, you can't guarantee that you're offering your token that you're selling ends up in the hands of the US, which is a big problem. So that's one thing that we are also mindful of in terms of, but we also think that's one of the reasons decentralized exchanges right now don't have much volume.
And then I don't know if you all saw that article from last week, but apparently there was an article stipulating that apparently a lot of these large exchanges are faking their volume by like a factor of 10 or something like that. And then the most credible guy in crypto, John McAfee, today I saw an interview with him where, of course, on the crypto cruise, where he called Hit BTC a criminal organization because they're not, you can't trace where they are or anything like that. But, you know, joking aside, what is your perspective on the existing exchanges, on their transparency, on their reliability to, number one, maintain an orderly market as it is today, and then the next step, moving that market into a security token marketplace?
So first I'm going to comment on Carlo's point in terms of the decentralized exchanges. I think as crypto people, we all think that that's a greater and better business model at some point. We would all like to see these decentralized exchanges thrive. But there is relatively lower volume there, and part of the reason is because of what Carlo mentioned. To put in a plug here, we are working on a solution to help enable, and this is what I meant by outsourcing or a SaaS-like function for our licenses in order to help these decentralized exchanges and foreign exchanges trade compliantly in the U.S. Now, to Mark's question here is, how are all of these foreign exchanges kind of manipulating the volume and doing a lot of things that are very questionable, I guess? I mean, there are many ways they do it, and again, they just don't necessarily comply. They do things that they would go to jail here in the U.S. for, basically, and there's just not enough rules in other places or clear enough rules that, you know, would force their hand. So they get away with it, and that's why they stay offshore. But like Larry said, if they sell to one U.S. customer, there's a buyer involved in any of these, then the SEC has it. The SEC feels they have the right to go after those exchanges.
And you know, FinCEN is definitely focused on these exchanges, and so glad you're getting your license because they are looking for compliance. So if you're going to be, you know, in that transmission of money flow, that you need to get your FinCEN license and follow those rules.
So,
just to fill in on that, I think there's just it's more like a policy problem than anything else, because it's such a gold rush the last kind of 18, 24 months on the exchange side of things, and we've seen that from the numbers presented by Binance and so on. That, you know, that kind of took over the whole kind of how do we actually want to operate this on a long-term basis to become the most credible, you know, exchange and so forth. It's not so much like a decentralized versus centralized exchange implementation. It's more like how do you want to run your shop, and you know, a lot of people wanted to run it in particular ways that were looking very good from an outward perspective, less so from an inside perspective. So I think now with the security token exchanges coming out, you know, it's a licensed activity, it's completely different rule sets. That's going to change in a big way. So we're seeing like people like Huobi invest into open finance. Okay, that's interesting because they want to get in on that kind of part of the market. And so they definitely want to be part of that kind of legit group of exchanges operating inside the US and then, you know, probably run a professional shop outside as well. So I think it's a market maturity thing more than anything else, that there was that, you know, early gold rush and a lot of that is maturing now. And with the introduction of security token exchanges, it's definitely maturing because that's the only way to do those here in the US and elsewhere.
So Huobi invested in our Series C round as well. So they're definitely getting very into trying to understand the regulatory landscape.
Right.
Yeah.
So speaking of regulatory, Larry, as the movement towards security tokens continues, what about the structures that companies you're dealing with are looking at? SAFTs were all the rage last year until they weren't. And then SAFTs were hot. And then There's foundations, there's consortiums, there are corporations issuing ICOs. What of those or other structures do you see as kind of emerging or being most useful for companies today?
Well, we are still doing SAFTs. So a well thought out SAFT that has a path to a utility token or securities compliance, we can get those closed. We closed a very large financing earlier this summer. Angela, I forgot the dollar number on it. Angela worked on that financing. We believe the SAFTE has some tax issues, so we don't recommend the SAFTEs. So a SAFT, for people who don't understand it, is basically an investment in a security that will convert into a token at a future date, usually after the network or platform is built, and in a way that's also compliant with the securities laws. And it may be, again, locked up for a year after that conversion. But there is a path that you can do the SAFT. But there's CFTC issues and tax issues related to the SAFT. We are still seeing people do ICOs in a private placement compliant method. I skipped the SAFTE. So SAFTE is basically, again, an investment that would convert into a token, but has an alternative that could also convert into an equity, your Series A or some other type of equity financing. We believe that there's some significant tax issues with the SAFTE, so we don't recommend the SAFTE. I am positive maybe people are doing them, but we don't recommend them.
So you see a lot of traditional investors wanting equity and tokens, which kind of looks more like almost, a warrant from the early .com days or a preferred. What is that looking like, or is that a SAFTE, or where does that fit?
So we're seeing more companies go down the path where they're either raising equity, or traditional venture capital type investments, and they may have not a warrant, but a side letter that would give them a right to purchase tokens if and when they get sold. We've done a few of those transactions. You had a lot of things in your question. So consortiums. Foundations. So we're not seeing a lot of foundation work. A lot of that was issued for tax purposes.
I mean, like, for example, Tezos, which was one of the biggest foundation deals early on, out of Switzerland. Like, why?
That was done, I think, mostly for tax. I mean, the issue is when a company, again, I'm not a tax lawyer, so I'll practice tax law with the caveat that if you're going to do something, talk to your own tax lawyer. And the tax laws are quite complicated and not always certain. You may talk to two tax lawyers and get different advice. But generally, when a company sells a token in the United States, it's taxable income as you sold property. So the IRS deems tokens as property, so it's as you sold widgets or some other product. So if you sell $100 million of tokens in the United States, you'd have $100 million of income and have to pay income tax on it. So there was a lot of early movement to go to the Caymans or other more tax-efficient jurisdictions. And I think people may still consider that if it's a large enough offering. But since tax reform, and a lot of our clients aren't necessarily thinking of doing that, given the cost and expense of moving to the Caymans. I'm not sure whether you guys are seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of, first of all, demand for equities in combination with tokens, as opposed to pure token offerings before. I think that's a new thing for 2018. Predominantly driven by mandates in traditional venture funds and so forth. I think the other thing is people are trying to become really creative in terms of how to open this up for retail. So we're getting all these kind of ideas around, there was one of the major banks that was putting together an ADR, which is basically the listing of a foreign security in the US, and then the foreign security would hold Bitcoin somewhere, I don't even know where. So it's there's a bunch of people that are really trying to get this out to the retail end of things right now, both on the institutional side as well as on the kind of the crypto project side. So I think we'll definitely see more of that. And then, it comes in the shape of form of, I think in most cases, equities.
Okay. So John, do you guys worry about all these issues when a company comes in and wants to be involved with Sharespost Digital Asset Group? Do you dig into their structure and where they're located and a bunch of lawyers looking at every deal, or how do you approach?
Absolutely. we vet the company, we vet all the organizational structures, how they are set up, and we use outside help to do that before we will even decide to list them or help them raise money or list them on our secondary exchange. So, I mean, I think this is one of those cases where it's better to measure 2 or 3 times and cut once.
How about you, Carlo?
That's the same. So it's kind of related to my comments earlier that we do have KYC AML providers in place. So in terms of our counterparties, we need to make sure our customers, we need to make sure we have fully vetted them and have the procedures in place to monitor and make sure that we're compliant with FinCEN.
So let me ask you guys, I mean, it's something that I've heard a lot of talk about lately, and I've had this experience with several clients where it's the conversation, do we list on, are we all in on 1 or 2 main exchanges, or do we go broad on 10 or more exchanges? And one of the issues I think you see with the existing exchange landscape is there tends to be relatively low liquidity. You look at coin market cap, there tends to be an overhang of a couple of exchanges for any issue that do a lot of volume. The rest are trailing kind of that don't. Maybe if you guys could talk a little bit about that as it exists today, and do you see that changing as these security token exchanges get lit up, or will there be a way to harness the overall liquidity without having to go exchange to exchange?
I mean, I think that market is maturing quickly right now. I think, whenever earlier this year when you were looking at any kind of listing offering or whatever costs, whatever we want to call it, it was almost increasing on a monthly basis, and like the decision criteria were pretty unclear. And then it was like a very convoluted process where sometimes there would be, some tokens that just got listed very quickly, and some others like, no, you have to pay $500,000. No, actually, that's a deposit, or maybe it's not, or you have to pay $2.5 million. It's just kind of a very weird market where
some places took Lambos too, right?
Yeah, well, and it's just, it just got ridiculous in the end, and it's like, this very convoluted process, and you get different, information depending on who you talk to about the same exchange. So I think that was what it was, and I think that's maturing very quickly. I think there's going to be a shakeout in the market for the exchanges that don't have their internal processes and policies in place to operate like on a long-term basis, like on a serious long-term basis. And then, like many of the big guys have already shown, there's probably going to be even potentially a higher potential in being part of the security token market and providing a licensed exchange in that space, which is potentially a much larger market than what we've seen around the utility tokens, at least long-term.
I think just one comment on that as well. It's interesting in the exchange space that almost every year there's a new main player. So before there was Mt. Gox, and then there was, after that, last year, Coinbase, then Binance. So we see that the market keeps changing, and there's always a new player. So for us, for our trading systems, the fragmentation actually helps because we're developing trading systems that can get best execution for our customers. So for us, we have to be quite agile in terms of which exchanges we deal with and which we can source some potential mispricings and some better execution on.
Okay, so one place we haven't spoken about at all is Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico has been a hot area of conversation, obviously, for the beneficial U.S. tax treatment of both companies and individuals. It's a U.S. territory, but Act 20 and 22 allows for no income or individual taxes if you move there. I haven't heard of a lot of companies flocking to Puerto Rico. Why is that?
I haven't been there, but the infrastructure is kind of poor. And from what I understand, there's also interpretation because it's where you earn your money, not where you just sell your tokens. So if you want to take a more conservative approach and you have a giant crypto piggy bank and then you show up and you want to monetize that and sell it while you're in Puerto Rico, a more conservative interpretation in Puerto Rico law, again, I'm not a lawyer, but is that you have to prove you earned it there. And if you didn't earn it there and you earned it somewhere else, you still have to deal with other jurisdictions' tax.
Yeah, I will support the infrastructure point. We even have an impact fund that's, with the purpose of rebuilding infrastructure in Puerto Rico on Swarm. So that's exactly where that's at. And I think, it's not only about, like, if you're not going to operate like a licensed business, let's say like a security token exchange, it's more important, like, where you sell your tokens or where you operate than where you're domiciled. So like domiciling in Puerto Rico, I don't even know why would you do that. Like, it comes back to the criteria that Larry mentioned. It's like, okay, I want to be able to trust the legal system. I want to have it in a place where people recognize the place as somewhere you can actually do business on a long-term basis, and you can, enforce legal agreements and things like that. Those are key criteria for where you set up your shop. And then this whole, like, the offering side of things, I mean, that's on a country-by-country basis. It doesn't really matter where you set up shop. You have to comply with each of these countries anyway.
But you see a lot of companies in the crypto space who are becoming kind of armchair international jurisdiction and tax experts. Like, what, I'm going to set up in BVI, and then I'm going to have a, sub-entity in, over here and this and that. Like, is that something that companies, at the end of the day, I mean, companies need to build a product that people want, right, and works. Is that something that companies should be worried about, or should they just call their lawyer and be like, tell me what I should do? Because I met a lot of entrepreneurs who are like way in the weeds on.
My opinion is you build your business for the long term and to build a viable blockchain product and token that works. And if it makes sense to have your operations offshore for whatever reason, then you go offshore. But the first move shouldn't be, I want to do a crypto thing, I'm going to move to Malta. That may not make a lot of sense. You have to get engineering. You have to build your product, and it has to make sense for what you're doing and why you have to go there.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's like, if you're Binance, you make more money than Deutsche Bank. Yeah, you probably need to think about those things. For us, running, like, operating on the level that we are, it's just kind of more important just to kind of set up in a good location where we feel that there's, resource available to do the stuff that we want to do. And then because we do working with securitization of different types of assets, it's actually the asset owner or the fund sponsor that many times dictates where they want to have their, the legal domicile for whatever SPV or other vehicle that's being used as part of that token offering.
So the cost is one thing to really consider. The big four accounting firms will help, companies migrate to the BVI or Caymans, and it's very expensive. There's a lot of transfer pricing issues. There's a lot of issues. I think the quotes I was hearing a year ago were well over $500,000, close to $1 million of just accounting fees to do that properly. So it's not as easy as I'm just going to set up a sub and do it. To do it right, to withstand the IRS, you have to really bring in the experts, and the accounting firms are expensive.
Yeah,
as well as lawyers.
There was like there's been a legacy there as well. Like a lot of the PE funds and venture funds are set up out of the Caymans and have done so for years. So they've kind of built up this pretty frothy cost structure down there that, they're trying to transfer over to now, which is now effectively a startup world. They can't really carry any of those costs. So, but at the same time, it's like you have all these other countries like Malta and Estonia and other places, Gibraltar, that, they're trying to pitch to become the new hub for something, because obviously they're looking for business and tax income and, a growing economy, which is all great. But at the same time, it's like, which of these countries can you actually trust long term? And like, who are just trying to like grab a few businesses by saying, hey, come to us, which is obvious that that's happening with a lot of the small countries, especially around Europe right now. And like, I don't know, long term, it's probably, working in the US or working in some of the large countries, once they kind of catch up in terms of the speed of regulation, is probably better, is my guess.
So, Larry, that brings up a great point, and I don't want to flog the SEC, even more. But when do you think we're going to have some sort of clarity, or at least a very basic definition of a safe harbor where we can get rid of some of this uncertainty? Because everything, at the end of the day, still comes back to the U.S., right? People need to do business here, and just to be like, oh, we don't have a no action letter, like it's like lack of bad news is good news, right? Wouldn't it be good if we had like some basic understanding of what was allowed in the U.S.? Do you see that happening? And if not, why not?
I'm not sure whether the SEC will do a rule or release. They may issue no action letters. I think there was, as I said, in June, some real good guidance from the SEC on a path to be a utility token, although it's a really hard test to get there. They have a relatively new digital asset or crypto token czar. She's, I think, was retained in June. So my expectation is we're going to see a fair amount of enforcement action come out in the next couple months that will guide us more. And I think they're looking to have companies come to them with their plans and proposals. But I don't know whether they're going to come out with the rules and release on this or safe harbor, just given the technology is moving. And I don't know if they want to be putting those rules out. But I hope they do. As a lawyer, I would love to have them put a release, and we wouldn't have to read tea leaves, and we would just be able to tell people, these are the rules, let's follow them.
I mean, isn't that something that would make America crypto great again? If we had some guidance, like wouldn't I mean, seriously, wouldn't companies really flock to the States if there was?
Oh, as I said earlier, I think having clear rules of what you have to do is what people want, you know, and a strong, it's when it's gray and it's uncertain, when people are trying to do the right things and still get in trouble. That's the problem. That's, okay. You know, when people are trying to do the right things and just, you know, the rules are uncertain.
So one thing is kind of clear, I think. The SEC, they have seen the public markets in terms of volume of these technology companies lag. More and more companies are staying private. It's $1 trillion asset class now, the private market shares. I mean, the concept of unicorn was invented not too long ago, and unicorn means one. Now there's like hundreds and thousands all over the world, in China as well. They do want to see a pathway for regular investors to gain access in a compliant and safe way to this asset class. Whether you can create a tokenization of that to help enable that is, I think they have no problem with it, as long as it is compliant and as long as you're helping people get access to something that won't cheat individuals, they're okay with.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys to take out your crystal balls. We'll start here with Carlo. And I'll ask each of you for a prediction about what you see coming in the next 12 months, and then we'll open up for questions from everyone.
I think on the regulatory side, I think I'm bullish on the security token market because I think right now there's just so much uncertainty. So even for us, operating in the U.S. is a big challenge, and that's why we're also looking at, we work with partners or have offshore entities to do that. So I think that's a space that's a lot of projects are focused on developing that market. I think things like tokenization of real assets is a great thing for the space, because I think one of the things that if you have hard assets backing tokens, then a lot of skeptics will actually see that, okay, this has a bit more substance than some of these ICOs we've seen in the past. So I think those things, it will take some time to develop. I think like on the institutional space, that's something, institutional investors' involvement is something that the market has long been hoping for. I think that's still a ways away because there's other challenges. There's things that still need to be solved, like custody and some of these other things. So I think in a year's time, I would hope that we have moved further in that direction, in developing these kind of products and having a bit more clarity on regulations.
I see 2019 as a year where the security token marketplace makes great strides. There are too many smart people in this room, on this panel, that are working to solve problems in that space. And the market size for that is just too big to ignore. I mean, on any given year, there's roughly about $1 trillion of IPOs in the traditional markets across the world. If you just take 50 basis points of that and transfer it over to a security token marketplace, that's bigger than, you know, last year's utility token offerings. So a lot there to play with, a huge TAM, and a lot of smart people trying to solve problems like the ones we've talked about today.
Yeah, I see a combination of like market infrastructure coming in place for security tokens, but also like the inflow of other types of investors, like non-crypto investors coming in to invest into tokens. And a lot of the people that I talk to on the kind of family office side of things and so on, they just haven't been able to engage because it's just so uncertain, like a lot of the things that you would want to buy even outside of Bitcoin, like where do you even go? Like after you buy some of your first Bitcoin, you kind of have to figure out like what to buy next. And it's a really hard decision to make because there's it's very difficult to value these things, right? So now with the introduction of like, tokens that actually have an underlying NAV or some other kind of asset that can be priced and valued, then that brings in a whole new group of investors that then require the security token infrastructure to be in place. So we're obviously, part of building out that infrastructure on global level, where one of the key elements is what we call the MAP protocol, by which, if somebody in the US wants to sell a security token to a guy in Singapore, we need to verify that both of those are allowed to buy and sell respectively that particular token. And instead of having like compartmentalized whitelists, like many other companies are approaching this, we're actually creating like a global whitelist that gets interconnected so that this can happen on a global scale. So I'm very excited about rolling out MAP next year, and then just growing the number of assets that get tokenized.
I think you'll see the rise of the tokenization of assets. That'll be the new thing. I do think it will help with investor confidence that you can use the tokens in a way to increase access to markets. And I do think it's going to help a lot when some of the bad actors you're going to see a lot of enforcement on the bad actors, and we clean up the market from the pumpers and dumpers.
Okay, very cool. Now we're going to open up for some questions, but first I want to ask you all a favor. We have a little 3-question evaluation form that we would very much like you to fill out. My colleague here, Adriel, can you go get those out front and hand them out? Thanks. They're real quick. And so if you could just give us your feedback, and then if you have any suggestions or ideas or people that you'd like to hear, please let us know, because we're here to serve you guys. Also, our next event is going to be on the 24th, and it's going to be about community building, and that's going to be really cool. We're going to have a really interesting person involved, Joe Richmond, who used to run Spark Chain PR, is now an investor, and a couple of other really great companies, most likely Definity as well. So stay tuned on our Meetup channel. We're going to have more information about that. So yes, sir, in the back there was a question. Yes?
I wanted to ask about the Reg Plus offerings and why they're so unpopular, and how owners are they exactly?
Okay, so the question is Reg A pluses, why they're so onerous and why they're not so popular. Is that right? Pretty much, okay.
Well, compared to an IPO, they're not onerous, but so Reg A, so as I said up front, when you sell security, so if you're doing a security token or any token today, it's basically a sale of a security. There's 2 ways to sell the security. Either you register them or you find an exemption. So generally, we've been talking about an exempt offering of security or a token under Reg D Rule 506. That's what we've been generally talking about with the 1-year lockup. So when you register a security, there's 2 basic ways. There's something called an S1, which is a very lengthy process where you see today when companies go public. You can go through that process. You've got a very lengthy registration statement and a very lengthy prospectus, and the legal fees are usually at least $1 million. The accounting fees are close, and it's a very expensive process. You don't see a lot of small companies do that. So Reg A Plus, they increased. Usually it was at one time Reg A was only $5 million. It was increased to $50 million, and 70. Sorry, but it's one where we've had companies use it to sell equities. We've got clients considering it to do tokens, but again, it's going through a very lengthy disclosure process with the SEC. It's uncertain how the SEC is going to react to the disclosure, and I think a lot of the early stage companies don't want that cost.
Have there been any cases where they finished up already and success?
Not to my knowledge.
Does management have a higher liability for these exemptions as the others?
Is there more management liability?
There are. Yeah, well, I mean, you have liability for fraud. Anytime you're issuing securities, whether it's registered or exempt, you have liability. So this is a longer conversation, but there's different parts of the act that have strict, like basically a false statement, material fact. You may have strict liability versus evident intent, but my recommendation is no matter what you're doing, you're going to have risk to your investors for any false statement of material fact. So, whether you're doing a private placement or a Reg A Plus or an S1, you're going to have the same exposure if you have, fraudulent statements to your investors.
Okay, yes, sir. Roger.
So let's say you follow the safe route of raising.
Give me a bunch of these.
So you had a loaded assumption in your question, which is you have a utility token. Just because you have your platform up and running, I don't think the SEC is going to say that's a utility token. What they're saying is a utility token would be a decentralized network where one company is not really in charge. So in your assumption, I don't think the SEC, they would probably say that's still going to be a security if you're raising money to do your
Thank you, sir.
Yes. They have a whole bunch of factors, which is too long for today to go through, but there's more than that factor, but that's the key factor.
Yes, sir.
So it seems like a token is just a name for a row in an electronic ledger, essentially. And the technology for tokens existed before Bitcoin. We have databases and APIs that are fairly well understood. But it seems like the main barrier for democratizing security is regulatory friction, not the technical side of maintain a token. The introduction of Bitcoin, the main differentiator seems to be the ability to build the ground So with the security token, how is it that we kind of have the worst of both worlds? Importing what we're calling the anonymity, the computation resistant, those properties that we remove, left with what we have for the decentralized network, which is presented as a token.
Right now, because of all the regulatory requirements, there is a case that there is some compliance which makes it more onerous. But to your point, there are other benefits of tokenizing assets, which I think were discussed earlier. So things like transferring and having fractional ownership, things like this, which are still helped by security tokens. Also, just setting up infrastructure for these things is much simpler. I think one of the problems in our space is initially the promise of, even in what we do ourselves is in creating decentralized financial products is, the problem with that is the concept itself just doesn't really fit in with the regulatory framework right now. So that's why we're kind of, how do we move to this kind of operating area where we are regulatory compliant? So that's part of a lot of what we were discussing today. So your point is right, but I think there are still some other advantages that using this kind of technology does bring versus traditional technologies.
I mean, I'll build on Carlo's point. To transfer a private security these days, Uber or Lyft or something like that, the settlement process could take as long as, if not more, 30 days, because you need the company the company has the right of first refusal. Now, if we can create a way to transfer that ownership in a tokenized digital way that's compliant, it'll cut that in drastic numbers and make it a lot easier for everyone.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Question for John. Earlier, talking about volatility on asset-backed tokens. I'm curious if you could elaborate a little further on that. Just thinking about it, when you give liquidity to something that typically is illiquid, I would imagine volatility would increase, particularly when thinking about real estate and how REITs kind of serve that buffer between the retail investor and the underlying asset. When you remove that, do you not believe that these things would be more volatile?
When you give liquidity to an illiquid asset, you're going to have price discovery. And while you have the price discovery, there may be some volatility, but there is an underlying value associated with it to keep it within the range of where that thing can trade, conceptually at least. When you have a currency or a pure supply and demand utility token that you cannot figure out exactly what it's worth, you allow great dreams and large TAM exercises to take your mind to different places and allow you to dream big or dream small.
I completely agree. But I was thinking more so when you look at the Bitcoin market right now, and you have people selling, not necessarily any technical analysis, but because of personal issues or hesitancy in the market, do you not see any mob effect on terms of?
Oh yeah, I mean that's going to exist in any market forever. I mean it's
Even real estate assets back in 2008. So real assets
yeah,
have volatility.
absolutely. We're not saying no volatility. I'm saying less volatility than utility tokens.
I mean,
Like all these things are going to have mark-to-market risk that never had mark-to-market risk before.
yes,
Sure.
I mean, that raises a really good question. I mean, if you correlate the price of Bitcoin and when the CBOE futures came in, right, it's like straight down because now you have a lot of shorts. Is it a good idea to have short markets on something as new and volatile as crypto assets, or is the horse already out of the barn on that?
My belief is yes, and you have price discovery. Shorts help price discovery. Now, in terms of back to that gentleman in the back, in terms of volatility, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's all about trade-offs. So the person who needs to sell in order to have liquidity personally will think that that's a great thing and will absorb the volatility happily. So it's a trade-off. You're never going to be in the perfect world.
And maybe it just seems, I think people think prices are continuous, but they're not, right? Something doesn't have to go from 10 to 9 to go to 7. And so I think people think they want liquidity until they start to see markets gap down. And when markets gap down and think something can go from 10 to 5, and skip through 9, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, then it's a different animal.
Oh, yeah, I mean, you're talking about portfolio management and psychology now. That's, again, there are trade-offs. I mean, we're all human beings, so when we see things go up and down, we're going to react differently. But conceptually, you should be pricing that asset according to your research methodology and staying with it. I mean, part of the reason why the last 8 years have been great for private equity and for venture capital firms is because they're stuck in it, and they have to be effectively sometimes lever-long, guys with no exit. Now, that's great from 2010 to 2018, but would that have been great in 2007 and 2008? No, you would have been screaming to figure out a way to get liquidity.
So,
Yeah, I think, just establishing like a global trading infrastructure and a market in itself is going to introduce a lot of the behaviors that we already see in a lot of the public markets. I don't see any reason why this would be any different. I think the difference is going to be that, the underlying asset, as long as we don't create like too many derivatives on top of them, is actually going to be much easier to value. And therefore, there's a reference point that's at least different from, let's say, cryptocurrencies, if that was now, what we're comparing with. But I mean, look, is there an argument not to create liquidity just because you might get volatility? I mean, there are actually ways, like worse ways than getting like a volatile market when you're sitting in Vietnam with 35% annual inflation. You're trying to buy a US-based asset and you can't, and all of a sudden you can. And it's going to be somewhat volatile, but like, so what? You've just opened up a new, opportunity that wasn't there before. So, I don't see that that's an argument to not create this infrastructure.
I do think that's the point I was going to raise. I think what the SEC is going to be worried about is disclosure. So when we have mortgage-backed securities and credit card-backed securities, those are hard. That's why it's usually institutional investors. And in 2007, you had a bunch of people package up crummy, mortgage loans, and then you had our rating agencies rate them, AAA, somehow thinking that because you could structure the waterfall in a certain way that you turn the crummy mortgage loans into good mortgage loans and buy a AAA security. I think you're going to have a lot of concern by the SEC that if you're going to tokenize an asset, you've got real good disclosure on what you're, what the asset is, what the risks related to the asset are, and then how the waterfall for that asset works with the tokens. And there's going to be risk that people are going to get it wrong. But I do think there's a lot of benefits of it. So
let me ask the panel. So there's more liquidity, there are more options, yet you see companies out there right now having a really difficult time raising capital for offerings. And you hear that investors are like afraid of the price of Bitcoin or worried about the price of ETH. What do you all think is going on right now in the market? I mean, there seem to be a lot more interesting projects, and at the same time, you hear about other projects that are like, raising a lot of money. What's going on with this whole market dynamic? I'm sure a lot of people who out here is like starting a crypto company or a blockchain company and is raising. Okay, so we have like 10 entrepreneurs in the audience. What do you all think about what's going on now?
As I said earlier, I think if you've got a good product and a good plan, it's going to solve a real problem, and there's money out there to be raised. But I think the day of doing something quick and easy and pump and dump, that's gone, and that's good for the market in the long term. But that said, investors are worried about the regulatory situation and are much more hesitant to make an investment. And then I think the 1 year lock, the 1 year lockup, has probably discouraged a lot of investors who were coming in to buy and resell quickly.
Well, I think it's, if we exclude Bitcoin, which has its own kind of, complexities when it comes to like figuring out whether it's going to go up and down, and then Goldman says something and then they kind of retract that statement or whatever. So there's all kinds of things that are very difficult to understand around Bitcoin specifically. I think around Ethereum, it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. I mean, we had like a very large number of ICOs over the last 18 months. And most of those were raising capital in ETH or Ethereum. Most people that they pay do not accept Ethereum, although some do. Most of them don't. They still have to pay for, normal kind of services in US dollars and fiat currencies, which means that we have like this huge downward pressure for all of those projects to finance their operations. And then on top of that, you have regulatory uncertainty. And then on top of that, people are actually trying to like understand whether Ethereum is actually going to serve them as a, adequate enough of a platform. If you're trying to do, relatively high volume transactions, then it turns out it's probably not the best platform. But then again, there's no other platform out there that has the same amount of exchanges and devs, in their ecosystem. So I think we're just kind of trying to find out now how much selling pressure is there around Ethereum, and when does it kind of catch up where real projects show real utility, and then it kind of catches up again and turns around into like a more positive trajectory.
I think the crypto market is definitely not easy to raise money for young entrepreneurs right now. But today versus 10 years ago, there are way more channels for an entrepreneur to raise money, whether it's because of the Jobs Act with Reg CF or Reg A+ we talked about earlier. Concept of being an entrepreneur has been kind of institutionalized. I mean, I look around the room, and half this room probably when they came out of school and undergrad, they went to banking, law, medical, and that's just what you did. But today, if you're a talented young guy, you can go into a Y Combinator, you can go to a StartX. There are just so many opportunities for you to build your business and find capital. Maybe not in the crypto right now. That was just an additional channel, additional distribution channel that may have existed a couple of months ago, may not right now, but it may come back soon, especially with security tokenization.
I also think there's still investors looking in the space, but given the current state of the market, they're just being more selective. So whereas in the past you could have gotten by in a white paper, I think it's moving more towards where I think rightfully should be. There has to be a bit more substance, or there has to be more traction from the companies who are looking to raise. I think as well, overseas markets, Asia, for example, I think there's still a lot of capital there. So there's other pockets of capital that's still being available for promising good technologies, good companies.
Cool. We'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up, and everyone can come and talk to people. Yes, sir, right there.
Yeah. Do U.S.-based companies stand to be at a disadvantage worldwide competing if regulators drag their feet to allow non-accredited investors to invest in securities? And how do you see
Do you mean in raising an ICO or raising, I mean, I would imagine someone would respond that it's going to protect our investors, so we want the regulation. You're cutting out all the fraud and so forth.
I understand the motivation, for the regulations, but it seems like the U.S. will take their time, and that other countries overseas might have more quick permissions for non-accredited investors in the U.S.
Well, you're seeing that, and that's why you're seeing people go offshore. And definitely the added legal cost is not an advantage, so I would think it's a disadvantage.
So, I mean, that is, there was someone at a panel recently who said, as far as he knows, there's no correlation between your bank account and your intelligence in terms of, accredited versus non-accredited. So I guess part of the question is that distinction going to go away? Then another thing I really like, I keep hearing that 100% of Bernie Madoff's victims were accredited investors, right? So just because you're an accredited doesn't mean you can't get ripped off. So, and the early days of crypto were supposed to be like crowdfunding, right? It was supposed to enable this kind of democratic, with a small d, movement into investing. Has that lost now, or will that come back?
In the US, yeah, for sure, that's gone. Yeah. So I think there's, to some degree, if you're looking for a community of token buyers that is predominantly community and less of, let's say, of an investor profile, yeah, I think that deal is gone in the US. So, that's the, whether it's a disadvantage or not depends on what you're trying to do with your project, right? But, I mean, that's certainly a difference between the US and, some other jurisdictions that don't have the same requirements for accrediteds.
I think for us, definitely us being headquartered in the US is a disadvantage. So that's why we have our offshore entity. I think because of, it's easier to work there because our company, our strengths are technology and finance. But now we've also had to become, to some degree, legal experts, and a lot of our expenses are for legal, just navigating the regulatory environment right now. So that's why, Orrick mentioned as well, one of the reasons we have an offshore entity is because we can go to market more quickly. So we can test, which is important for our startup. We need to make sure we put our product out there, see if people want it before we want to invest more in getting a version that's compliant and we can offer in the US. So that's given us a lot of flexibility to have that kind of channel.
All right, guys, I just want to do a final shout out to our sponsors, but first I want to introduce to you all one of my co-organizers and the new global head of community for Consensus. Come on over here, Jory. And we're happy to announce that Consensus will be a Crypto Mondays sponsor very soon, and we're going to be doing events at your
new space at Sansom, 115 Sansom.
Yes, so we're really excited about that. This is Jory. If you ever want to do anything community-wise with Consensus, she's your person. So now go home to your kids. They miss you. Okay, cheers. Big thank you to Orrick for hosting us tonight. Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Orrick. And a big thank you to our live stream BeFast TV over there. Thank you very much, BeFast. And we also have the Security Token Academy in the back that's doing interviews with people who are interested in security tokens. Come, Security Token Academy, you guys? Okay, back there in the corner. So if you guys are into security tokens, you want to talk to them, please go talk to them as well. But the biggest thank of all goes out to Carlo, John, Timo, and Larry for putting on a great panel tonight. We hope you found it interesting. If you don't, then don't come to any more events. No, seriously. If you guys want something better, instead of saying this sucked, why don't you say what you'd like, or why don't you give us some suggestions? Because we're not making money doing this. We're doing this to help the community and help everyone learn, and the world is changing really quickly. So with that, I want to thank you all and hope to see you again in 2 weeks on the 24th. Thank you. All right, guys. Thank you. Thanks. Hey, we should get a picture here.
Yeah, for sure. Somewhere in Europe, then came back.
Did you go back home, or?
Yeah.
Just in front of